Hello there, everyone, and welcome once again to One Idea Away. I thank you so much for joining us just week after week as we get these episodes out there. And one of those topics, we've talked about a few. We talk about connection and mindfulness, and we bring in some of the neuroscience, and we bring in people's personal journeys as well. And I found that recently, maybe I don't know, over the last couple of weeks, maybe even couple of months, that this sense of personal freedom, that idea of really connecting to freedom itself in life is something that seems to be coming up more and more for whatever reasons people may feel certain constraints or limitations that are going on right now with their life or their career or maybe even their relationships. This is an interesting one for me. For those that maybe are avid listeners, maybe you've heard me mention this before, but freedom has always been a huge value of mine. It's always kind of been at the center of so much of what I've built my life around. And yet, the way that I used to define that sense of freedom, quite a few years ago compared to now is very, very different, right? And so many of us have that definition of freedom as initially we think about it as almost that, doing what we want, when we want, with whom we want. And of course, even if we get that in our lives, we come to realize it's pretty circumstantial. Almost like life has to have these certain criteria for everything to magically fall in place for us to then feel freedom. And instead, what I've come to understand and what I think you've heard from many of the guests on this show, and today is going to be no different, is how much that sense of freedom within is really what we are truly after and what fuels so many of our journeys of trying to get to that space, that truth that lies within all of us. And you're going to hear a pretty unique journey of finding freedom, I guess you could say, today in a very, very different way. And so we're today on today's episode, we are very grateful to be joined by Dr. Patti Ashley, actually right in the midst of just releasing her latest book, Letters to Freedom. And today we're going to get into the topics of certainly finding freedom. We're going to talk about grief. We're going to talk about codependency. What a fun topic that is. We're going to talk about love. We're going to talk about self-love, maybe some vulnerability, and even working in that notion of grace. So let me properly introduce Dr. Patti Ashley to you. She's an international workshop presenter, author, speaker, psychotherapist, and authenticity architect. Love that phrase. Who brings unique insight into the identification and treatment of trauma, shame, grief, as well as dysfunctional family patterns. Her signature model of authenticity architecture creates long-term changes in the brain as well as in the nervous system, breaking through barriers to personal freedom and authentic growth, and excavating the truth of self-love, belonging, and connection. It's in her 35 plus years of experience, including developing and teaching continuing education courses for physicians, hospital wellness programs, university and other private organizations. It's her own private counseling of individuals, couples, families, groups that she's done. It's in her retreat setting as well as her online work, and certainly through her multiple books, the latest of which is, as I said, Letters to Freedom, From Fear to Love to Grace, which is really a beautiful and powerful memoir of grief and relationship. And it's that level of experience, expertise, as well as a personal journey that Patti brings to us today. And with that, Patti, thank you so much for joining us on One Idea Away.
Thank you, Luke. It's great to be here.
So I guess maybe let's begin with this. Before we talk about this, I'll say notion of freedom, which we'll get to in a moment. Mm-hmm. If you could tell us just maybe a little bit of the backstory, as it were. You talk about, some of the work that you do with families, and certainly your family history is one that has had a major impression on your life journey. And I was wondering if you could maybe start a little bit there so that people get the context of the journey that you've been on.
Yeah. So when I was 11 years old, my father died of a sudden heart attack, and I was raised in a very strict Catholic family. So strict, we lived across the street and went to Catholic and could walk. I could hear the school bell ring in the morning, and I would walk. My mom wanted me to be close to school and the church. So there was this belief that when people died, they go to heaven and they're with God. And I was 11 years old, and my father had really been my best friend. He was just the most kind, gentle man. A lot of my friends had these mean, gruff dads, not me. I mean, I had this really fun dad. We'd take me to the park and we, joke around. And so suddenly one morning he's gone, February 4th, 50 years ago, this coming February. And I, being kind of an introspective person, had a lot of questions. Where did he go? Why can't I go there? Who's God? Where's God? And also, why can't I talk to anybody about this? I don't feel like anyone really wants to talk about something that I feel is pretty big, but it was more of, well, let's just, get back to school and let's just get back to our life. And so when I was in high school, I decided I wanted to be a psychotherapist because I thought, well, I want to give people a place to talk about these things that I couldn't talk about, because that was back and he died in 1970. So back then therapy wasn't what it is now, but there's still a stigma, there's so much. We're talking now about mental health. And so yay, we're beginning to have more real conversations about it. But back then you just, just went on with your life. So I decided I wanted to be a therapist, but the guidance counselor in high school told me I wasn't smart enough, because I was struggling with depression. I was, unresolved grief around my dad. So I took kind of a twisty road and got a degree in special education, taught kids with emotional disorders, became a mom, then got into early childhood and parent education. And I'm still longing to do this work as a therapist. So I went back and got my PhD in psychology and did my dissertation on women not feeling good enough as mothers. That's my first book, The Shadow of the Too Good Mother Archetype. And I've been in private practice here in Colorado now for 20 years, and I love it. And I love that I took kind of a winding path, because it gave me so much more information around child development, which is really where all of the beliefs that we have in our lives get set up.
Yeah.
So that's why I created Authenticity Architecture. So I could talk more about that in a minute. But what happened 3 years ago was I lost my fiance to a sudden heart attack, the same way I'd lost my father when I was 11. And it was a relationship that I felt I was moving into in a place where I had really healed from my past. And he was a sweet, kind gentleman, just like my father, and very healthy, very unexpected, died of a heart attack the same way, both of them found on the living room floor. So I was so in shock and, taken aback that I wanted to write down stories of our time together so I could remember them. But then I also wanted to kind of rewind the tape, because we're both pretty intuitive. We thought that, we could, intuit anything. And of course we should have known that he was going to die, right? Even though we don't. I mean, it's such a mystery. But I was like, were there signs? And I wanted to write stories about maybe there were signs. And there were, actually, and I write about that in the book, a few subtle ones, but I don't think these things in life we ever really know. And I think that's the hard part for us humans. We want to control everything, right?
Yeah.
So his name was Lawrence Freedom. And I had written him letters at a couple times in our life, one when he was traveling and one when we were going through some rough relationship issues. And the last letter I wrote him right before he died, I was putting into this box that I made to keep his letters for him. And I got the call that he had died. And so that's why I titled the book Letters to Freedom. The subtitle is From Fear to Love to Grace, because that's a book he was working on before he died. And he had lost his wife of 20 years, a few years before him and I moved into a relationship. I had known him for years, a well-respected man in the addiction treatment field here in Denver, Colorado. And he was my go-to guy for addiction treatment. And so his wife had died, and I watched him go through that. And I watched him go through his experience of opening his heart to the level of grief. And he found what happened to him was he went from this fear of loss to stepping into a really deep love that he had for her, and then something even bigger, which he called grace. So I've put together a Fear to Love to Grace Summit with 18 different authors, and that's available on my website too for people to get in addition to the book. But yeah, it's a legacy of love to these two men that I adored.
Yeah.
And I love that I get to do that kind of, I love being a therapist. I love that I've stepped fully into my authentic life.
Yeah.
And it's not that I haven't had sorrow. I've had deep grief and sorrow. And that's what brought me back fully to my life, really.
Yeah. And I do absolutely want to talk about that side of it. And I think for everybody, I will just say, I mean, it's, the memoir itself, Letters to Freedom, is such a, you give such a wonderfully beautiful, vulnerable, transparent glimpse into what life was like, as you say, with these two men, as it were, and the journey that you've been on, for your own path, your own journey back into love and self-love, and this incredible journey towards freedom, which happens to be Lauren's freedom as well. And so, I guess let's start maybe with that topic of grief, because I also do want to ask a little bit about that early childhood development process as well. Mm-hmm. But from a grief standpoint, agreed, not only, I think, back in the early and 70s and beyond, even today, we're not a culture that seems to handle grief well at all. We seem very, very averse to the idea of facing that type of pain and that type of trauma, potentially, depending on, especially out of order type of deaths that we face, certainly in the course of life. And I'm just curious what you've kind of learned through that process of what, grief really actually held for you, so that maybe we can start to, those that are listening, start to reframe what grief can be.
Great question. You hit the nail on the head with why I published the book, because I really was hoping that a personal story would open people a little bit. And what we're watching now with Kobe Bryant is doing a similar thing. People are going, wow, this life is short, life is fragile, what it must be like for his wife. How do people do this? And I didn't know a whole lot about his family, but apparently as a baby, right? A little baby too.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's so much about how we help people process that we don't talk about. And I think because we live in this culture of, we want everything to feel good and look good. And we've got so many modern conveniences. We've got nice heat in our house now. We've got, air conditioning, we've got lighting, we've got the internet, we've got medical technologies. 100 years ago, we didn't have these things. And people's lifespans were shorter, and they did grief in a different way. Now we have this experience of, we want to be immortal. We want to keep people alive. We don't want to talk about the fact that we're all going to die. It's just going to happen at some point, sometimes suddenly, sometimes not. But any way we do it, it involves a deep loss and sadness. And if we have an open heart and we feel, we're going to feel. The more deeply we feel love, the more deeply we feel grief. Yeah. And vice versa. The more deeply we feel grief, the more deeply we can love. And that is hard for people to get, because they want to go, oh, well, I don't want to love too much. Yeah. And actually, that's what happened to me. And I wrote that in the book. Yeah. When my mom was wailing one night, a few months after my father died, I remember walking upstairs to my bedroom, and her bedroom to my right, and her door was closed, and she was crying so hard. And I grew up in a family where it was, don't cry until I stop crying before I give you something to cry about. You didn't cry in my family. You didn't talk about feelings. You were very stoic. And to hear my mom cry like that, I remember saying to myself, I'm never going to love like that. She loved my father. It was just this sweet love story of, being the man of her dreams, came back from World War II and asked her to marry him. And so that's what we do. We go, ooh, I'm not going to do that. And even in subtle ways, we don't open our hearts. And that's what happened with me. I kept attracting unavailable men, and thinking, why don't they want to be with me? Well, it's because my heart was closed. So that's why when I met Lawrence Freedom, I was like, okay, I think I got this. And then he died the same way. And I thought, well, here's a lesson for me and hopefully for other people. So we don't talk about grief because it hurts so bad, and we don't want to hurt so bad. So I think the lesson is, how do we witness and support people through the hurt so bad part? And not try and talk them out of it, and not try and fix it. People say, right after Lawrence died, saying to me, well, how about some rescue remedy, some herbal, tinctures? How about, look, why don't you do this? People always want to make it better, but we don't realize that you can't make it better because your heart is broken, because you love that deeply, and you need people who can be brave enough to witness that. And I found that was even in my line of work with quite a few enlightened people in my life and therapists. I still felt like I don't want to burden them with too much of my crying and my stories. But what I learned about grief was you have to tell a story at least 100 times. So grief groups and support groups and supportive people and writing. And I think even writing the story. So for me, it was so therapeutic to write the stories and then to have to read them over and over and over through all the edits to the point I was like, I don't want to read this story one more time. And yet it really helped move the grief. And that's how we go through grief. We can't go around it. We have to go through it.
Yeah.
And it's very, very painful. And we just don't want to do that in our culture. And that's the unfortunate part, because that's what brings us back to life is, believe it or not, feeling
absolutely. Pain. And I think it's you described something in there that stands out to me, and I'll put slightly different words to it, just in the way that kind of I relate to it, is that when we get into that level of discomfort, and certainly grief is kind of that ultimate discomfort at that type of level, is we start to pull back and almost we stay very, very guarded, right? So we don't want to touch those emotions that are so powerful and seem to kind of just, bring us down to this raw level. And we're so afraid of that. So we start to put up these walls, we put up these boundaries, we keep it all guarded. And of course, we then cut ourselves off even further. We isolate ourselves even further from the experiences of life that actually are what we really want most. And so now we've got to, find our way back up over this wall, when really it is, how is it that we go through it? Which I think is another great way of what you said, is that we can't go around it. Can't even really go over it. We got to go through it.
We got to go through it. And that's the one thing I learned when I, in my 30s, decided to do my own unresolved grief work. And I was determined to do it. And that's why when Lawrence died, I thought, whoa, I know so much now. How do I do this? And it's still hard. I was still feeling like I need to hurry up and get over this. Nobody wants to hear these stories anymore. I was still doing that to myself, and I was very aware of it, which is why I think writing stories is so helpful. Because it gives us a chance to express that. Khalil Gibran has a poem, Joy and Sorrow. And are you familiar with that? Where he says, some people say, which is greater, joy or sorrow? I say, nay, they are both the same. They go together, because you can't have one without the other. So the deeper we feel our sorrow, the deeper we can feel joy. The hard part is, again, we don't want to go in there. We'd rather just kind of skip over it, but we can't.
And I'm glad you brought it back to that, because I think it's, again, I relate this back to that notion of that personal freedom, that sense of personal freedom that so many of us like to think we want to have in our lives. And yet, what we're opening ourselves up to by feeling the depth of these emotions. When people talk about, you see this phrase like live fully, more and more and more that's out there. Well, we can't just live fully in one direction. Right? We can't just live fully towards the one emotion or the couple of emotions that we like. Live fully means we got to take it all in. We've got to experience the whole array, the whole spectrum that's there. And yet there's something that, as painful as part of that process can be, there's also something that is both liberating and beautiful about it in the same way, for the time that we have had in those moments and through those relationships. And maybe if you could just comment a bit on some of the early childhood side of this, because I think this is, you went through grief very early on, and that leaves imprints. And I'm not sure we all recognize as adults, kind of looking back, to quite the degree that those early childhood days leave some pretty significant imprints on us. And we don't know how that still plays out in our lives today. So maybe if you could just share a little bit of that.
Great question. Because that's what was in the back of my mind when you were talking, was, the fact that I did study early childhood and child development has informed me tremendously, and also given me an opportunity to pose those same questions. I think curiosity, when you look at kids, they're very curious, right? And curiosity is the most important thing. So to be curious about those questions that you just posed is so helpful. So for me, it's the fear that anything or anyone I love is going to go away. And it gets set up in the sensory, nonverbal body memory. So that's why we can't just have a thought and say, well, that's ridiculous, So the work of authenticity architecture is really about digging up those unconscious beliefs that are kind of running the show. I recently interviewed Harville Hendricks and his wife, Helen Hunt, and they're really well known in the area of relationship. And so I asked them specifically in the Fear to Love to Grace Summit, how losing a child, losing a parent as a young child, how they see that show up in relationships. And Harville shared the most beautiful, heartfelt story of losing both of his parents as a child. And and so he said the exact same thing. He said, even to this day, I'm afraid of losing the things I love. And he looks over at his wife, and I said, Helen, how is that for you to hear? And they just super sweet people. So I think even though we're conscious of what may have gotten set up, we're always working with challenging those beliefs. And that's the hard part for people too. Back to, I don't want to feel pain. I don't want to feel that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to go into that. That's ridiculous. Get over it. And if we go back to some of the early childhood pieces that I learned, which I think is the biggest aha, is looking at Alice Miller's work. She was a Swiss psychoanalyst, and she went back and she researched 18th century child rearing textbooks, and she found all these shame-based teachings, like that's where we get spare the rod, spoil the child. You should be ashamed of yourself. Don't be angry. We parents were taught to talk kids out of their feelings, to shame kids for their feelings, and literally to break the will of the child before they were 7. So if we look at that and we think, oh, the 18th century, that's, a long time ago. Well, it isn't really, because we didn't until the last century start researching child development and understand that that really was not the right thing. Yeah. And we made a lot of mistakes. And so we started to clean it up a little bit. But the reason I wrote my book, Living in the Shadow of the Too Good Mother archetype, is because the harder women I found tried to do it better. The more books they read, the worse they felt about themselves, because they're still repeating this unconscious pattern. Yeah. So they're also finding now that we're carrying at least 14 generations of ancestral trauma in our DNA. So that adds to the body memory, unconscious repetition. And then this is all these are all the reasons why we avoid pain and suffering and sorrow, and it's all unconscious. Yeah. So I'm so happy to have these conversations like the one we're having today with people, because I really want to make the unconscious conscious for people. I want people to understand that children develop really differently, and that we need to be aware of that. And that's how we build the ability to tolerate all of life's joy and sorrow. Yeah. And it's just brand new. I say it's hot off the press. This is brand new stuff. We don't know that. The Children's Hospital here is doing a great commercial where they're showing little kids jump up and say, our blood is different. We need different types of treatment because we're kids. And it's a great commercial for physical health. I want us to do that with mental health. I want us to say, we don't think like big people. Our brains don't develop like yours. So here's what we need, Yeah.
Yeah. It's an incredibly important conversation. I just want to draw, a few things out there. One is that these ingrained unconscious patterns and these beliefs that are there, it's one of the things that I found when I started to recognize that my values around freedom really weren't the circumstantial kind. They were much more about being free within. Well, the universe and life plays this wonderful, wonderful joke on you of, oh, that's what you want. Well, let me show you all of the ways that that's not true for you right now, right? And you just start seeing all these things that are contrary, because those are the things that are actually limiting you from feeling the type of freedom you're looking for. And of course, all of those limitations are within. They're from the beliefs and the attitudes and how that affects our perceptions. And you tied it to something that was really important that I don't want anybody to miss, was you tied it to the way it literally connects us into our body, into our nervous systems. It's wired, and it's not even just wired in our brains as we think about them. It's wired throughout all of us. So there's neuroscience, there's chemistry, biochemistry, and everything else that goes into these patterns. Yeah. And when we begin to make them conscious, meaning that we are aware that some of these patterns exist for us, we can also learn, and I think this is the nature of some of the work, and by all means, please elaborate on this side of some of the work you do, is that we not only become aware of the beliefs or those patterns to work on them mentally, that's part of the process, but it's even to be able to recognize how we're feeling into them, the reactions that we get, and how is it that we can actually, I guess, essentially reprogram ourselves in such a way that over time we're releasing what we need to release, and we're building more into the healthy patterns and the patterns that we really wish to have in our lives. I was wondering if maybe you could comment a little bit on that connection there between mind and body, really, and just how fundamental both sides of that are to creating sustainable change.
Yeah, absolutely. And the most common or the most important piece of research we have now is Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory.
Yeah.
And he looks at how the nervous system has evolved into a social engagement system where emotional safety gets affected by these old parenting beliefs and by trauma and shame, and it gets set up in the body memory as danger, 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 very much like trauma. And so the vagus nerve goes from the brainstem all the way down. It affects digestion. It affects the heart. It's really about how do we calm our nervous system and feel emotionally safe, so that we can quiet those body messages. And he talks about, and I just am finishing, it's in the final proofing at the publisher, my next book on shame-informed therapy, the art and architecture of reconstructing the authentic self. And it's with a company that does professional education for therapists called Pesci. I've been doing some training for them. And so I'm so excited. This book is going to be coming out hopefully in the next few months. And I took Porges's model of the 4 therapeutic R's, which are recognize what's happening in the autonomic state, respect that, because that's been what we've developed as a way to cope, regulate that, meaning how do we get into the body and calm that down, and then restory. And restoring is we're going to write a whole new story about safety. So for instance, in my story where I'm afraid people are going to leave me and they're going to go away, I have to pay attention when that might get triggered and respect that that's just something that I set up to protect myself. We're talking about the protecting myself earlier, and feel into I'm safe. It doesn't matter whether or not, anyone leaves me. I'm lovable for who I am. Just because my father died doesn't mean that I did anything wrong or it was my fault. So, that's a really quick way of talking about the 4 therapeutic R's. And in the book, I go into detail with different tools and techniques for therapists to use. And I think what we found now with the brain, the neurobiology of this social engagement safety is we want to give the brain messages and the nervous system messages of gratitude, joy, pleasure, curiosity. Whenever we're in those feelings, we can't be in the fear. What happens is, and this happened for me a lot, growing up, because I couldn't talk about my grief, and people, in the Catholic Church are supposed to be grateful. And I would be, I'm not grateful. I don't want to be grateful. Don't make me feel grateful, because nobody wants to talk about the fact that I'm sad. And so it wasn't until years and years and years later, I realized that there is a paradox that you can be in grief and also pull into the gratitude, which actually helps. Yeah. I was really grateful that I had the experience with Lawrence that I had. And I was really grateful that I had the people in my life to support me. And I was really grateful for the lessons I learned, but I couldn't pick a side. Yeah. Martine Prechtel says that grief expressed is grief and praise all at the same time. When we're grieving, we're praising. So anyway, we can't be in these feelings of curiosity and gratitude and joy when we're trying so hard to not have grief, which is seems kind of counterintuitive, because I'm like, I don't want to feel grief, but I can't really feel gratitude. So that's when we stay in this kind of numb state, or we get into maybe addictive behaviors. Yeah. So I can't even remember your question because I've been rambling on here.
But the way that you connected that into that mind body connection, and I think this is one of those really important things I wanted to bring out, is that before, so many of us, when we're in that discomfort and we feel like, okay, we're going to go through it, we want to jump to that restory side so fast and just kind of bypass everything else and just come along, because it's so much easier if we can just kind of explain it away. But that ability to not only recognize what you're going on, but to respect it
Hmm.
and to regulate it is actually that going through process that allows us to stay where we are, to understand and validate where it is that we are, and be able to literally, I don't want to use calm, but I down regulate the nervous system in such a way
Yeah.
that it can actually hear us again. We can be in communication, because if we're too ramped up, and our inner kind of, the amygdala is firing away, and we're in stress mode and fight and flight and everything else, we can't communicate with ourselves. We're isolated. We're in a totally different state that cannot learn and cannot grow. And so we've got to go through this process if that restoring of what's going to be is actually going to be understood as well as felt inside of who we are. So, I really appreciate you going into that as a model for everybody to pay attention to. I want to shift just a little bit, because there was a couple of quick things that I kind of wanted to drip on, because I want to get to the love and grace side of this too. To transition to that, one of the things in Letters to Freedom that I think it's funny, because I've seen people write about codependency and dependent relationships in different ways. And there was such a softness, a different understanding, a genuine understanding that you gave to it, and connecting it and letting everybody know that when there is a dependent relationship, what's missing is a form of self-love that is actually missing there for individuals. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit, because to me, dependency is not, we may hear of codependency, we may picture something in our minds, but dependency is on relationships. It's on things, it's on addictions, it's on so many things. And it really, at the heart of it, is this question of self-love.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Good question. It's interesting, because one of my early editors read the book and she said, I think this is really about codependency. This is more about codependency. I'm like, no, I don't want to talk about that.
I don't want to go there.
I didn't even really want to put it in there, but it's part of the story. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it's really important. And I think, so the dance that Lawrence and I were doing was really about dependency and relationship, because he was, we look at attachment theory, and like in my situation, I have avoidant or ambivalent attachment, because I'm so afraid to love the way my mother loved, but yet I really want to love because it was a sweet story that she had. And my whole dance, again, in the body memory, was not really allowing that to happen. So when Lawrence showed up, I thought I had it all figured out and I was ready to do it. And then what showed up, though, was his dependency needs, because he was a recovering addict. He'd been sober from alcohol for 34 years, I think. Wow. His father died of alcoholism, and he did great work in the field of addiction. But because he was never single ever, and his whole entire, got his first marriage, like right in college, went right into a second marriage, and then his second wife died, and then it was me. Yeah. And so my, my codependency was, we both wanted to take care of each other. We're great in relationship because we were both very, much caretaking. Can I do this for you? Can I do this for you? It used to be for me, I would be the one that would be the codependent one. And anyway, we did this dance in our relationship, which, at first, the first year was great because we just loved each other a lot. And then the second year, all of those pieces in our body memory were coming up. Like he felt like, when I would kind of need my space because I'm used to being alone, he would feel like I was abandoning him. Yeah. And then he would get needy. And so we really started to talk about that towards the end of our relationship, and talk about maybe we just need a little bit of space, for us to kind of recalibrate our individuality and move back into relationship, without so much of the togetherness, which I don't know whether that's a good idea or not. I honestly don't suggest it. However, it was my own, fear that he was just with me because he didn't want to be alone, which wasn't true. He loved me. I know he loved me. And I loved him. And we knew that at the end, but and that's why I thought the signs that maybe he was going to die were part of this kind of pulling apart, because anyway, so codependency in relationship is usually a defense against shame. Mm-hmm. It's, again, back to that self-love, and that's the story, right? That's the re-story. Mm-hmm. And we're all born. I mean, Brene Brown defines shame as the feeling of being unworthy of love and belonging. And we're all born worthy of love and belonging. And that feeling just gets chipped away at and doesn't develop in the right brain and the nervous system because of what I think is these old parenting practices and some of the lack of information that we have about how that sensory social emotional development happens. And so I think we're all struggling with how to really come back to that sense of self-love. And because it is so ingrained in the body memory and even in the DNA, it's a hard piece of work to say, I love myself. I don't know. People don't want to say that, because then it becomes narcissistic. Then we go into the other extreme of, well, if I love myself, then but narcissism isn't self-love. Narcissism is a false self put on to look like I'm lovable, but it isn't self-love. So self-love is being humble and curious and having humility and accepting our imperfections and being okay with who we are, where we are. It's not an easy task for any of us right now. And codependency is one of the ways it shows up. And just really overgiving, people pleasing.
And I think this is a bit of part of your background. I'll kind of share a little bit of this from my own background, but then please tell me, kind of where this fits in for you. Is that part of, to me, it's where meditation, mindfulness, those types of practices have been very invaluable to my own journey, because it's given me that chance to almost learn to be with myself and to not follow some of the ingrained patterns and stories that are there, but instead to be able to observe them, be able to watch them, be able to feel the emotions when I've needed to feel the emotions, but not to make them anything more than emotions, than what the feelings happen to actually be. And in doing that, it created I'm not sure if objectivity is the right word, but it created a different way of being able to observe some of the patterns that would normally have sent me into a place of really criticizing myself, a lot of self-doubt, a lot of lack of self-love. And when you open up that space and begin to kind of honor your journey and honor where you are and be able to feel what life's experiences are for just what they are, good, bad, or otherwise, whether they feel comfortable or not, all of a sudden just this, it's hard to describe. It's like this space begins to open up within you where you're comfortable and accepting of self again, in a very, very different way. And I don't know if you can put different words to all of a sudden where that dial all of a sudden clicks over, but that's sort of the path that I headed down to learn to be with myself once again. And then all of a sudden just something started to open up, and it was a lot easier to bring acceptance back in.
Well, it's that mindfulness. It is present moment awareness. And that's the piece where we have a hard time, because when we're so in the past or we're so worried about the future, then the nervous system kicks in and we're in this, got to figure it out, fight, flight, or freeze, la, 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 la. So when we come back to mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn, Joan Bornsenko was actually one of my authors I interviewed for my Fear to Love to Grace Summit. I love her. And all these great people who studied mindfulness and gave us, all these teachers who gave us some tools for meditation and mindfulness, are tremendously important, because that is it. And I was thinking that too when you were talking earlier, how important mindfulness is. So I'm glad you circled back around to that. A lot of times people, just like they say they can't love themselves, they say they can't meditate. They can't quiet their minds because the left brain monkey mind is just working overtime. So I like guided imagery as a way to help people get into meditation. Like Shakti Gawan did a bunch of good things in the 70s. There's a ton of them out there now. There's apps on the phone. So to just have somebody lead us down a path. I do this a lot with my clients, when they're really in the hyperarousal state. And let's just take a journey, and let's, maybe meet a guide, or let's go to a calm sanctuary, Heart Map in California, doing some really good things with head heart.
Yeah, wonderful.
With these meditations. So that's what happens is we get out of the story and we calm the nervous system when we're able to be in the present moment. And sometimes the guided imagery gives us something to keep the left brain on, but we're still actually rewiring while we're doing it. So it's really super cool. I also work with mandalas as a mindfulness practice. And, the adult coloring books came out not too long ago. Yeah. Well, actually, it's been a few years now. I thought, wow, this is great. We finally are realizing, because when you color, when I work with mandala, I'm in the creative process or any kind of art. If anybody likes to do any art or anything like that, all those things are ways to bring us into the present moment. When we're in the present moment, that's when we can be in emotional safety. And I always tell my clients, well, look at what's around you right now. You're safe. You know, everything is fine. There's nothing, there's no danger.
Right.
Feel that. Bring that in. That's the mindfulness. That's the present moment and the more we do that, that's how we're regulating and restoring the nervous system as opposed to the story. So if you look at like cognitive therapy, where it was really about changing the story, like you were saying earlier, you know, we can't just say, well, I'm afraid that the people who love me are going to leave me. And the truth is I'm okay and safe and supported. If I don't do that middle body piece, the sensory piece, the nervous system piece, rewiring, we know we can actually rewire the right brain for feelings of safety and love and joy by giving them those experiences. So again, you know, it's holding both and, you know, if I'm in grief, I don't feel like I can do that. And I really can't really necessarily in that moment. But if I'm fully present with my grief, I'm actually allowing myself to move through it, like we talked about earlier, to get to the other side, but we try and avoid it.
So a couple of really great resources you mentioned, and then I've got one more kind of maybe big question for you. But you've mentioned Stephen Porges, for everybody that's polyvagal theory. We've actually interviewed Stephen on the show before, so you can find a past interview with him. John Kabat-Zinn's work on mindfulness or mindfulness-based stress reduction. Joan Borsenko certainly is part of that movement as well. And the Heart Math Institute, the work that Doc Childra, Howard Martin, Deborah Osman, all of them have done up there is just really some great stuff, especially in that heart-brain coherence piece, which is so critical for our nervous systems. I guess, Patti, the last kind of really, it's a big question, but I would like to kind of bring it full round here, is that the subtitle there of the book that you used was From Fear to Love to Grace, bringing in, you know, a lot of Lawrence's work. And I guess I'm just a little curious of maybe to describe first what grace is to you, but then how is it that we can create a little bit more opening for grace inside of our lives?
That is a big question. And it is the question that I ask all the authors I interviewed too in the Fear to Love to Grace Summit, which will be available on my website for people if they're interested. So I ask every single person the same question at the very end, just like you're doing with me. And I'm on the same, like, well, it is a big question because it again, I think grace is more of the nonverbal that we've been talking about. It doesn't, some things don't have language. And so we're trying to give language to something that I think is more of a feeling. And I think for me, I mean, what's my quote that I quote Anne Lamott? She says, grace meets us where we are, but leaves us completely different. And, you know, it's that ability of knowing that there's something bigger. There's something more. And I think I feel a little teary-eyed because I think that's what I learned about my relationship with Lawrence and losing my father. You know, when my father died, it was, he's in heaven. And I said, well, then why can't I go there? You know, and I couldn't go there because suicide, you go to hell. So I had to like stay here. And why can't somebody tell me who's God? What's this heaven? Da, da, da. So I was on this spiritual path my whole entire life. Then I meet Lawrence, who's a science of mind practitioner and so into his spiritual practice and trying and working towards bringing that into his addiction treatment program. And we just meditated together and we did dream work together and we had this yummy spiritual experience. And so after he died, one of my friends said, you know, the two of you had that when he was alive. What makes you think it's any different now that he's gone? I was like, ooh. So the grace part of my book, the subtitle, the book's divided into three parts: fear, love, and grace. The fear is about losing my dad. The love is the juicy love story. And the grace is what happens after he died. And so the stories around the grace are really about like the dreams, when he would come to me, my dreams, and tell me he was really, really here, you know, feeling a sense of him saying, you're never, ever alone, which is what I actually in a meditation with Deepak Chopra, when I was in the 1980s, I was in a meditation with Deepak Chopra, and I went into he had us meet someone in the meditation, and my father showed up and had that someone give us a message, and it was, you're never, ever alone. So after Lawrence died and I closed my eyes and went into meditation, I heard him say, "You're never alone," and so that to me is grace.
Yeah.
It's knowing that we're never alone. We feel alone. We're not. There's something bigger that connects us all.
Yeah.
And Chopra's new book, Meta Human, I just ordered it. I'm so excited about it because, he speaks so much to, we're so much more than what we realize and what meets the eye.
And,
so that to me is grace, is being able to know that and to the wonder and the awe.
Yeah.
The curiosity.
And I think that's so much of what allows it and opens us up to it is that sense of wonder, the curiosity, the desire to tap into and touch awe, even just that openness to say, I'm going to keep my eyes open and see what the possibilities are, but to see what some of the messages are that might be there in any number of ways. I know you shared quite a few of them, including the ladybugs inside of the book, which I encourage everybody to check out to know what that means. And so really just wonderful, signs of synchronicities and grace that pop up and just keeping ourselves open to the possibility. Dr. Patti Ashley, Patti, I want to thank you so much for being here on One Idea Away, for sharing your book as well as Lawrence and your own journey and your own story with us, as well as all of the wisdom that you bring.
Thank you for having me, Luke. I appreciate it. And I just noticed my brain made a mistake. I said Deepak Chopra meditation. It was actually John Bradshaw, because I had Deepak Chopra's new book on my mind. So I just want to correct that. And Ladybug showed up in my dreams 2 nights ago too. So
cool.
You'll have to read the book to understand.
Oh, that's cool. And for everybody, John Bradshaw is another really great resource for everybody.
Yes, he was great.
So what I'd like to wrap up with for everyone today is actually a quote that Patti shares inside of the book, actually quite near the beginning, and it's from writing that Lawrence had done. And I want to leave you with this because this is how, as Patti described, Lawrence saw our journey here on this planet Earth, on this incarnation. You were an expression of love before you were born. You will return into love when you pass. Between your first and your last breath, your true mission is to remember the love that you are and to extend this love to all those around you. I can think of no better way for us to sign off today. Until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks again for being here. Check out IPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com/OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com/community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.